Hello, everyone, and yet again, welcome back. We have more history, more learning for you today. Today, we're going to be talking about, again, a lot of information. This is coming at you really quickly, just trying to cover as much as we can within this week. But today, we're going to start our discussion by looking at the post-war of 1812 period. As you might recall from your discussions about the War of 1812, this was a conflict that really sort of broke out over concerns that the United States had over its sovereignty to engage in commerce freely without intervention on behalf of the British. In the end, in 1814, the Treaty of Ghent is signed, which brings about the end to the War of 1812. And following that war, the United States enters into a period that has been referred to as the Era of Good Feelings. Now, historians were not the ones to actually give the name the Era of Good Feelings, and we know that to be true because historians can't name anything. Think about the name of the War of 1812. How boring is that, right? We can't even give it a name. We just got to call it when it started. So you know that the Era of Good Feelings was not named by historians, but historians have adopted this title to sort of describe the period of history. It was about a decade or so long period of history that ran from about 1815, we'll call it 13 years, to about 1828-ish. Why is it called the Era of Good Feelings? Well, part of the reason for this has to do with one of the outcomes from the War of 1812. During the War of 1812, many Federalists, and remember, there was two political parties that existed before the War of 1812. You have the Jeffersonians, and you have the Federalists. And what's very interesting about these two parties is that the War of 1812 really causes the two of them to sort of shift to so that they become like the other, right? Where before the war, Federalists were big government, very pro-British. They were not necessarily looking for a rural economy. They wanted manufacturing. And the Jeffersonians were the exact opposite. They wanted small government. Well, during the War of 1812, the Federalists became very against the war. Part of this had to do with the fact that the war had adversely affected their shipping and their commerce. This was particularly true because of Thomas Jefferson's Embargo Act. Hopefully you guys are remembering that. But nonetheless, what happens is the Federalists have a convention in Hartford. And what takes place is they begin to threaten secession if the war doesn't come to an end. They don't do that. But they basically begin to have all these demands about the war coming to an end. And they issue this Hartford Convention right at the moment when Andrew Jackson wins the Battle of New Orleans. And the Battle of New Orleans gives the United States a great sense of nationalism, a great sense of pride and patriotism. And then the Hartford Convention demands come out. And it really just makes the Federalists look like tyrants. It makes them look very unpatriotic. And ultimately, the Federalist Party dies. And so this idea of an era of good feelings is partially employed because there's no longer the political infighting that you had had from the first few years of the country's history, right? The Federalists are dead, and all that you have left are these Republicans. Sometimes they're referred to as Democratic Republicans. Again, that gets confusing, so historians just refer to them as Jeffersonians. So you have one political party, and so you sort of have this so-called era of good feelings. The other reason why it's called that is because following the election of James Monroe, you have an individual who is not necessarily disliked by any side. James Monroe is fairly popular. And in fact, the term the era of good feelings is monikered. It's given during a goodwill tour. Monroe had actually taken a number of these as he's traveling throughout the country. And as he's traveling, a local newspaper says that Monroe is presiding over an era of good feelings. And the name has just sort of stuck. There's a lot of very interesting things that go on during this era of good feelings. And I oftentimes refer to it as the so-called era of good feelings because in many ways it was not an era of good feelings, and I'll explain that here in a second. But one of the things that occurs during this period is an intense amount of nationalism. And following the War of 1812, the United States is going to embark upon building itself up to become a stronger, more powerful country. I mean, in many ways, the United States is still a relatively small country. It's still a new country. but it feels like a big country. It just took out Great Britain. The way I talk about this sometimes is it's like you go to the gym and you run your 1 mile and you lift your 10-pound weight and then you walk outside and you think you could beat up Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, right? I mean, you're just feeling great about yourself. When the reality is you couldn't do anything, right? And that's kind of how the United States feels. We took out Great Britain. We're this big, powerful nation. Not really, but we feel that way. And so we begin to build up our military. Our economy begins to build. In fact, during the War of 1812 and after, the United States is going to begin to embark upon a process of industrialization. We're going to talk more about this specifically later on, but we begin to engage more in manufacturing, particularly in textiles. And you're going to really see factories being built in the northern portion of the country where paid labor will be honored. Now, I will say this as kind of a digression. Just because the South does not embark upon industrialization, they do retain a slave-based, farming-based economy. We need to understand that American capitalism was built on the backs of slaves. And that's a really hard thing to deal with and try to recognize, because how could coerced labor bring about free market capitalism? Well, the reality is Southerners grew cotton. Slaves grew cotton. Northern factories, which needed cotton, were going to rely upon the slaves to give them the cotton they needed to make the clothing in their factories. Same thing in England, okay? And we'll talk more about that later, but just understand, part of the reason why some folks view this as an era of good feelings is because, hey, the mechanisms of industrialization are beginning to churn. You see the creation of the Bank of the United States, or rather the Second Bank of the United States. There had been one previously created, but its charter was allowed to expire in 1811 on the heels of, just before the War of 1812 happened. In fact, one of the reasons why James Madison, following the war, supports the creation of a second bank is because he saw how ineffective the money was being managed during the war. Initially, James Madison opposed the creation of the first Bank of the United States on constitutional grounds, but following the War of 1812, he says, maybe we do need it. It's kind of a necessary evil. But there's a lot of growth, a lot of nationalism during this era of good feeling. But there's also some issues going on, which demonstrate that the country isn't as good as perhaps we might like for it to be. So, for example, in 1819, an economic panic hits the country. We call it the Panic of 1819 because, again, historians are great at naming stuff. And a lot of that had to do with the price of cotton and banks being mismanaged, but it had some strong ripple effects for the United States economy. I mean, it's not the Great Depression, but it is one of the first economic depressions that the United States experiences, and it's catastrophic. Another major issue that demonstrates that this is not a so-called era, or that this is not an era of good feelings, is something referred to as the Missouri Compromise. Now, you're going to want to be very aware of the Missouri Compromise because this is going to come up time and time again. But the Missouri Compromise is this. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson had purchased the Louisiana Territory. It more than doubled the size of the country, $15 million. That works out to roughly about 3.8 cents per acre. It's a great land deal. But we purchased all this land. By the way, we didn't ask Native Americans or anybody else living on the land whether or not we could buy it. We just bought it. But what happens is, over a period of time, settlers, folks moving into this territory, they reach the population threshold, and they therefore then ask Congress if they can become a state. Well, in 1819, 1820, the territory of Missouri says, hey, we want to be a state, but we want to come into the Union as a slave state. Now, I don't know the degree to which you guys recall, but our government is based upon representation. And at this point in our history, we had an equal number of non-slaveholding states and an equal number of slaveholding states. If Missouri had come into the Union as a slaveholding state, then their interests would have outweighed the interests of the non-slaveholding states because they would have been given more representatives. And this freaked out the non-slaveholding states because obviously they don't want to lose political power, taxation, among other things. And so, long story short, after a bunch of debates between Daniel Webster and Daniel Hayne and others, Missouri is going to be allowed to come into the United States as a slaveholding state, but they're going to carve out a portion of Massachusetts. We're going to call it Maine, and they're going to bring it in as a non-slaveholding state. And so ultimately, the Missouri Compromise didn't really accomplish anything. We went from having an equal number of slave and non-slaveholding states to an equal number of slave and non-slaveholding states. Henry Clay, who is Speaker of the House of Representatives, he's going to come in and he's going to say, look, in addition to bringing these two states in, we're also going to draw this line around the 3630 parallel. And any future state that would come in above that line is not open to slavery. Any state below it would be open to slavery. And the idea here is that we're trying to address this monumental issue of the westward expansion of slavery. And this idea of westward expansion is given a name in the 1840s, and that name is Manifest Destiny. The idea that the United States had a God-given obligation, a right to move from sea to shining sea. The idea here is that the United States would move its institutions, its schools, its religion, its language, its political ideology across the North American hemisphere, right? The term manifest destiny here means what it sounds like. Manifest means obvious or clear, and destiny obviously means what's going to happen. And there's this providential, this idea that God has ordained it. And so one of the things that you're going to find during this time period is that many, many Americans begin to move west in order to fulfill their manifest destiny. Okay? This has both positive and deeply negative consequences. Some of the positive consequences, of course, would be that as Americans move west, they bring with them new technologies. They bring with them railroads and telegraph wire. They bring with them farming and agriculture in a way that hadn't existed before. But the negative side of this, of course, is the fact that Native Americans were displaced. Their culture, their livelihoods, their ways of living were completely destroyed. They were removed from their land. In fact, during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who we will look at this week, a removal act was passed in 1830. It was called the Indian Removal Act, and ultimately it will result in a tragic forced march known as the Trail of Tears. Why? Because white Americans wanted to take the land that Native Americans had occupied. Even though the United States had created treaties with Native peoples, we oftentimes did not uphold those treaties, and we will just simply take this land. Native Americans are, of course, not the only ones adversely affected. Mexicans will be affected. You think of the state of Texas. Texas had once been part of Mexico. Texas will ultimately gain its own independence for about 10 years. It becomes the Republic of Texas, ultimately to be annexed by the United States. But there was a border dispute between Mexico and the United States as to where Texas's border was. And ultimately, this will erupt in a conflict known as the Mexican-American War, a conflict that the United States wins. And then we take land, a good chunk of it, from Mexico, including the state of California. And right at the moment when the Mexican-American War comes to an end, following the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo, gold is discovered in California at Sutter's Mill in 1848 by James Marshall. And that also helps to fulfill America's manifest destiny. And, migrants in the thousands upon the thousands and immigrants just descend upon California as an avalanche. And this has a lot of consequences, negative consequences, not just the fact that Native Americans were massacred in great numbers. By the way, there was about 150,000 Native California Indians in 1850. There was about 13,000 left by 1900. Wholesale massacres went on during this time period. I mean, even the federal government and the state government of California paid people to kill Native American Indians, Native California Indians. They write them checks, right? It's crazy. But there's also environmental damage, right? As we're looking for gold, as we're fulfilling our personal desire for wealth, as we're fulfilling our manifest destiny, getting from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, right? How do we get this gold that's deep, deep, deep in the mountainsides? Well, you blast it with hydraulic mining. And so manifest destiny has an indelible mark upon the United States because in some ways, some of our first heroes, John C. Fremont, Kit Carson, James Beckworth, Calamity Jane, among others. These people come out of the idea of westward expansion, right? The idea that the American settler went out to the frontier and tamed the wilderness, right? That's a very powerful image. But unfortunately, it's not entirely true either, because the territory wasn't a wilderness. There were people who were occupying those territories. And even though many Anglo-Americans didn't view native peoples as civilized, those folks were civilized. In their own ways, they were deeply advanced, right? Just because Americans couldn't see it doesn't mean it wasn't true. Now, not everybody is in favor of westward expansion and manifest destiny. There's a lot of folks who think that war against Mexico and moving west is a problem. But there's a lot of folks who did think it was okay. And so this week we're going to be looking at the era of good feelings. We're going to be looking at manifest destiny. But we're also going to be looking at the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson's presidency is deeply important for a number of reasons. Perhaps key among them is that much of what happens during his presidency, particularly during the election of 1828, sort of changed the trajectory of American political history. It sort of set the framework for how contemporary politics would function. One of the things you're going to hear this week is that before Andrew Jackson became president, many of those who presided over the country before him were afraid of democracy. They were afraid of mob rule. They were afraid of too much free speech. They thought only the best and brightest should govern. Well, Andrew Jackson, although he is somewhat aristocratic, he owns a plantation in Tennessee. He's very wealthy. He identifies as the common man. And because there are so many changes going on, particularly as new states come in and as new states are created, they write their own constitutions. And one of the things that they begin to do is they begin to get rid of the property restrictions, which had previously meant that only certain white men could vote. By the time that Andrew Jackson's elected in 1828, almost all white men can vote. Women, African Americans, not so much. They can't. And in fact, in some places, women and African Americans had been able to vote, in New Jersey, for example, but by the time the 1830s roll around, new state constitutions have sort of shored up that loophole. And so one of the things that's going to really be important here is that you find the development of new political parties that occur during the Jacksonian era. Remember, the era of good feelings was punctuated because only one political party existed. Well, by the time Andrew Jackson is elected in 1828, which was a rather contentious election, by the way, it pitted Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson believed, in fact, that John Quincy Adams had stole the election from him in 1824, and historians refer to this as a corrupt bargain. And you know, your reading in your films from later this week will hopefully get into that, should get into that. But Jackson creates what will at that point be called the Democratic Party, okay? There will also be the formation of the Whig Party, and the Whig Party was created in opposition to Andrew Jackson and his Democratic Party. The reality is that there were many people who viewed Andrew Jackson as being kingly because Jackson oftentimes defied the will of other branches of government. For example, during the Indian Removal Act, when the Cherokee were going to be forcefully removed from their land, the Cherokee took the United States to court, and the court said the land rightfully belongs to the Cherokee. Andrew Jackson said, the Supreme Court has made its ruling, now let them enforce it, right? And he seems to defy the will of the Supreme Court. Similarly, there is a war against the National Bank that Andrew Jackson will wage. Jackson hates the bank. He thinks it's only an institution for the wealthy and the elite, and he hates it. Congress wants to see the bank rechartered. Jackson says, no, I'm going to veto that. And so in some ways, the Whigs viewed Andrew Jackson as being King Andrew I. He's wielding way too much power. Now, like Thomas Jefferson and Washington and other presidents, there's a lot that we can talk about with Andrew Jackson, perhaps giving into the nullification crisis, which was really a significant event for a number of reasons, but chief among them is it demonstrates that one of the things that would rip the nation apart would be issues over tariffs, issues over the economy, and predominantly issues over state power versus the federal government's power, what we refer to as federalism, right? But again, I don't want to get into a 2-hour long lecture here, particularly because your textbook and other films cover this. But Andrew Jackson's presidency is significant for a number of reasons. One, it does result in the passage of the Indian Removal Act, which forcefully removes the 5 civilized tribes, particularly the Cherokee, out of Georgia, Florida, and other regions into Oklahoma. At the time, it was referred to as the Great American Desert. Jackson does destroy the National Bank of the United States. He vetoes a recharter on that national bank, and then he removes millions of dollars out of it. And ultimately, that contributes to economic downturns years after he's president. And then the nullification crisis demonstrates that there are sectional divisions. And so that so-called era of good feelings begins to disappear. We have issues over westward expansion. We have issues over slavery. And in fact, when we start talking about the causes of the Civil War, we're going to have to bring into the conversation that one of the central causes was the westward expansion. It was manifest destiny. We're going to have to talk about one of the arguments is the fact that the states wanted to have more control over their lives. And so during this week, as you're going through, begin to think about how some of these issues that you were talking about, whether it's the gold rush or Jackson's war against the bank or political divisions, whatever it is, begin to contemplate how those particular events contribute to what will eventually be the Civil War. So, again, as always, just scratch the surface. There's a lot there. But if you have questions, you want further elaboration, contact me. We can Zoom meeting and talk more about this at a later date. So, everybody, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a blessed week. And with that, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor.